welcome to our podcast on non-linear plot movies. In a previous podcast, we talked about the classical stages of plot development in major Hollywood movies, and that is a pretty prolific structure that has been used by screenwriters and directors for many, many years, and it still is exceptionally powerful in Hollywood today. But we also have a move toward experimentation in how one tells stories. And so that's what we wanted to talk with you guys about today, some of the methods by which people mess with plot in order to tell their stories. So let's review for a second. Here is your basic plot map. Whether you are reading a short story, a novel, or watching a movie, this tends to be the basic order of events in the plot. We start off with exposition, we have some sort of inciting moment, conflict arises, eventually that climax goes to the most important part or a turning point in the text, we have a climax, and then we need to relatively quickly wrap up the text, learn our lesson, and kind of move on. In linear movie storytelling, we have these plot stages that we use in our class to talk about the transitions from stages within that typical plot map. So again, we start off with the setup where we meet characters, we meet setting, we kind of figure out what's going on. Then we move into stage 2, which is complicating action, where basically a problem arises that the characters now have to deal with. Stage 3 is full of all of the obstacles that the characters need to face to now deal with this new conflict, whether they will or will not accomplish their goals. And then ultimately, stage 4 is the climax and epilogue, the most exciting challenge for the characters to face, and then ultimately, do they or do they not reach their goals? And then the epilogue, wrapping it all up, teaching us the lesson, we're done. But the question becomes, do all movies have to follow a linear pattern? Do they all have to go beginning, middle, end, setup, climax, and resolution? There are plenty of movies out there that don't follow that pattern, but are still exceptionally effective in terms of entertainment value, but also in terms of teaching us as an audience some lesson, some theme about life. A key piece of information we want to make clear before we move on any farther is the difference between what we call plot and what we call story. And so as we have said in previous podcasts, plot is the chain of events that is covered within a given text. So from page 1 to page 100, or in film from minute 1 to minute 90. Whatever is covered in that text, that is plot, the chain of events. A happens, then that causes B to happen, that causes C to happen. Things progress logically because of cause and effect. That chain of events is called plot. But if we wanted to go a little bit deeper and a little bit more theoretical, we need to think about the idea of story. We define story as the entire tale of a given fictional arc. So for example, pretty famous movie out there based on the book, but it's called The Wizard of Oz. And the plot of the movie Wizard of Oz, Dorothy arrives in Oz, ends up killing one of the witches. She tries to get to the Emerald City so she can get home. And all the while she is pursued by the evil Wicked Witch of the West, the flying monkeys, all those kinds of things. Eventually, she gets home. That is the plot of The Wizard of Oz. But then somebody else wrote another text years later called Wicked. It was a novel first, written by Gregory Maguire. It was then turned into a Broadway musical by the same name. The plot of Wicked is to give backstory on the two witches, Glinda of the North, the good witch, and Elphaba, the Wicked Witch of the West, the green one. And so the plot of Wicked gives some back information about how these two witches used to be friends. They went to school together, and then eventually they drifted apart. So the plot of Wicked serves as an element of story within the entire story arc of The Wizard of Oz and Wicked. So we can see that there's backstory here. So here are some techniques that we commonly see in non-linear plots. These are things that filmmakers do in order to take the beginning, middle, and end typical plot map and change it up a bit. Tell it not exactly in the ABC order. Number 1, the use of flashbacks, which by definition is incorporating previous events into the current narrative storyline. Pick almost any movie. The plot is moving along, we're learning about characters are doing things, but then all of a sudden we get a flashback, something that happened before the current narrative time. That technically is a non-linear plot. It may not be a big scene, it could just be 30 seconds, it could be 5 seconds. But if all of a sudden the current plot is interrupted by something that is out of chronological order, that drops it into that non-linear category. Now, another set of movies use what we call concurrent plot lines. Concurrent means happening at the same time. And so these might be movies like Crash, Love Actually, Valentine's Day, New Year's Eve, or Traffic. Movies like this. And basically what's going on is there are multiple characters and plot lines all happening at the same time. So we as a viewer will watch a plot line for a couple minutes. Then all of a sudden we will jump to another plot line with different characters in it. And they seem to be independent. So for example, in the Love Actually movie, we have the story of a young man who wants to go to America from England, and he wants to fall in love. So we follow him on that journey. He goes to, of all places, Wisconsin. But then the movie flips to the Prime Minister of England, played by Hugh Grant, and we see the trials and tribulations that he has. And then we perhaps even flip to a third storyline of Liam Neeson and his emerging teenage son who's very, very sad, yet he learns to play the drums. So all of these plot lines are happening at the same time, and it seems like they don't overlap at all. What makes these movies non-linear is that since everything's happening at the same time, but we can only watch one plot at a time on the screen, the director needs to figure out a way to tell these stories clearly and logically. But then at some point, all of these movies do bring all of those plot lines together. If you go back to our plot stages, that tends to be at the beginning of stage 4, the climactic stage. And sure enough, in Love Actually, we're following 5 or 6 different characters. The climax stage begins, and all of a sudden we see all of these interrelationships. The Prime Minister's sister was married to this guy who was in love with this girl, but that girl was a friend of this other person who was the friend of a filmmaker who was making this movie, who was being catered by the guy who went to Wisconsin. Something like that. So it seems like there's 5 or 6 different stories, but then all of a sudden they intersect at some point. So again, a non-linear structure. A third example of non-linear plot is what I call scene interweaving. These are kind of like flashbacks, but it's not like a 5 or 30 second little quick flashback. It's like an entire scene. So we have the plot mountain of A moving forward. Time is moving forward. But then all of a sudden we have these humongous interruptions with previous scenes. So in effect, they are flashbacks, but they are much longer. And so sometimes it feels like the movie is balancing current time and previous time with equal amounts. This isn't a 5-second flashback interruption. This is a 15-minute scene interruption. So for example, Slumdog Millionaire, Pulp Fiction, or Blue Valentine. And so here's a graphic organizer that somebody made for the movie Pulp Fiction. And so if you look across the top, you can see in shades of dark red, you can see the linear plot line of the movie. So it starts off in that dark red with the Butch Coolidge and Captain Coon's story, the Watch story. And then it moves into Vincent Vega and Jules, so the 2 hitmen. And you can see if you were to follow the top part, it would be in a linear fashion. But then you can see from the infographic what they did was, how does it actually happen in the film? What did Tarantino do to the order of things in order to make it non-linear? So you can see at the bottom, the very first scene that we actually get to see as an audience is in the diner, where the 2 characters are deciding what to do, and eventually they stand up and hold up the diner and steal everybody's money. That starts our movie. But then we go ahead and follow the Vincent and Jules storyline for a little while. And then we jump to Vincent and Mia. And so you can see how they took something that is linear, which is the top, but then split it up and moved it around and morphed it into what we currently watch as Pulp Fiction. So this is what I would call scene interweaving. These aren't necessarily flashbacks. These things are all happening. They have happened, but they're just large chunks of time woven throughout each other. And so the last example of a non-linear structure that we like to mention is what we call complete inversion, where in essence, the film is told completely backwards. So 2 great examples, Irreversible on the right, and then Memento, one of the films we typically watch in class, on the left. And basically what these films do is the first thing you actually see as an audience member is the last thing that has chronologically happened. So for example, in Memento, the first scene we get is one guy shooting another guy. We know that that is how this movie is going to end. We know that this character is going to kill this character. But then we sit there and figure out, well, why would he do that? What would cause these two characters, who seemingly are friends, why would one of them kill the other? We spend the rest of the hour-and-a-half movie trying to figure that out, and we start to slowly unravel the movie backwards. Now, the nice thing about Memento that Irreversible does not have is that in Memento, as the scenes unfold backwards, there's a little bit of overlap, which actually helps us as audience members. We can see that as a scene is ending, we get to see that same part in the next scene. So we can understand conceptually that this movie is moving in reverse. And so I think we as audience members have to deal with this. We have the traditional Hollywood patterns of setup, then complicating, then development, and etc. But people want to evolve, people want to change, people want to grow and test the limits. Storytellers want to tell their story and teach their theme in new and unique ways, but they can't confuse the audience. And so storytellers want to push the limits, push the envelope, challenge themselves, challenge their audiences, but they still need to keep their audiences with them. And so how do they do that? To their benefit, we as a society are pretty immersed in video and film already. We tend to understand the grammar of film even before we've studied it in a class like this right now. So for example, fade to black usually means the time has passed. We see scene A, fades to black, we see scene B. We just fundamentally get that time has passed. It could be an hour, it could be 20 weeks, it could be who knows what. But we understand that a fade to black means a certain thing. We understand that a close-up means a certain thing. And so filmmakers rely on that knowledge by the audience to push the limits of their non-linear storytelling. But they also use some relatively common cinematic techniques to help us out in case we miss something. So a great example from Forrest Gump. The very beginning of this film, Forrest is sitting on a bench waiting for the bus to get to Jenny's house. But all the time, people keep coming up and hearing his stories. So the very first time somebody sits down next to him, he relates this story about how his shoes came about. The filmmakers probably could have just done a straight cut from the old Forrest to the younger Forrest, and they wouldn't have to worry about making it clear. But they did some great things to help us out just in case we missed it. For example, costuming. Notice the plaid shirt that Tom Hanks is wearing, that blue and white plaid. As it flashes back to the younger Forrest, that character is wearing a very similar blue and white plaid shirt. So we know beyond a doubt that that little kid is Forrest Gump, just younger. Second thing they use, facial expressions. Notice how he's squinting his eyes at the top because he's trying to think really hard about this. And then at the bottom, he's squinting his eyes in the same exact expression because he has been told to keep his eyes closed as they unveil his magic legs. Basically, the braces on his legs that help him fight a curved back. They also help us through the use of dialogue. When Forrest is talking, at the top, he's saying things like, I remember when I was, and I was this. And so all of a sudden, the next kid we see on screen probably has to be him. Additionally, when we go to the flashback, the doctor who has asked young Forrest to keep his eyes squinted shut uses his name. He says,
All right, Forrest, you can open your eyes now.
We know that the kid on the table is Forrest Gump. We've met him before, we meet him here. And then the fourth technique oftentimes is that authors and storytellers will put text on the screen. So when we have that fade to black, we instantly know that this is a flashback. But when it comes back up from the fade, sometimes storytellers will say, 20 years later. Even though we could probably figure out that that fade lasted a long time based on what the characters say next or what the characters are wearing next, sometimes storytellers are going to give us one more technique of text on the screen to help us figure out where exactly we are in these non-linear plots. So that's about it for now in terms of non-linear plot movies. Many of the movies we watch in class tend to be very linear, beginning, middle, and end, beginning, climax, resolution. but there are some that we'll watch that will be told slightly out of order. And while we fundamentally understand a lot of the movie grammar, sometimes if we're not paying attention or we haven't figured out this film's grammar, we find ourselves becoming confused because all of a sudden the story is out of order. So I want to talk about some of the different structures and some of the different techniques that storytellers use in order to create those non-linear plots. Thanks so much for watching. As always, if you have any questions, please bring those in the class. We'll get those answered. Otherwise, thanks a lot, and we'll see you soon.